Morning, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, thanks for being here. I'm Elizabeth Denny, Director of the Outsider Art Fair. Welcome to OAF Talks and Performances. It's my pleasure to introduce our first conversation, Creative Growth, the Next 50 Years. Since its founding in 1974, Creative Growth has played a vital role in shaping the field, and over the past 2 decades has been an essential part of OAF, helping pave the way for progressive studios to become integral to the fair. We're especially excited to be having this conversation at a pivotal moment as Sunny A. Smith joins Creative Growth as Executive Director. Sunny is a nationally recognized artist and cultural leader, most recently serving as Dean of Fine Arts at California College of the Arts before beginning their role at Creative Growth in 2025. As an educator and institutional leader, Smith has spent over 25 years shaping arts education to ensure that curricula, museums, and archives reflect a more expansive and inclusive vision of history. Smith's work as an artist has been widely exhibited, including at PS1 MoMA, SF MoMA, and is included in the permanent collections of institutions such as the Whitney Museum of American Art, UCLA Hammer Museum, and LACMA. Thank you for being here, Sunny. Edward M. Gómez is a graphic designer, critic, art historian, translator, and curator who specializes in art brut outsider art and in Japanese modern art. The founder of brutjournal, he is a former senior editor of Raw Vision and has written for many newspapers and magazines in the US, Europe, and Japan, including the New York Times, the Japan Times, Art in America, and others. He has authored or co-authored numerous books on art, design, and Japanese art and culture. Among them, yes, Yoko Ono and the Art of Adolf Wolfli, St. Adolf Giant Creation. He is a member of the Advisory Council of the Collection de l'Art Brut in Lausanne, Switzerland, and a genuine luminary in the field of outsider art. Thank you for being here, Edward. The fair wants to express our gratitude to the co-sponsors of this talk, Jill and Sheldon Bonovitz, Diana Bose, and Beth Rudin DeWoody. Please join me again in welcoming Sunny and Edward.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the Outsider Art Fair this year, and particularly for taking time from your schedules to join us in this conversation. My name is Edward Gómez, as Elizabeth pointed out. We're very grateful, Sunny and myself, to the entire staff of the Outsider Art Fair for putting together today's talk and the events that will accompany it in conjunction with this year's fair. Today, what we're going to do is the following. I'm going to introduce myself briefly and put on the table my bona fides so you can see why I'm even here talking to Sunny A. Smith, the new Executive Director of Creative Growth Arts Center. The reason, briefly, is that I'm very interested in the institutions of the kind Sunny is now leading and what they do to serve disabled people using art making as a big part of their mission. And what we'll learn from Sunny today is just how far Creative Growth has taken this activity over half a century's period of time. So let's get started by what we call in Japan, where I spend most of my time. I go back and forth between Japan and Switzerland, where I'm involved, as Elizabeth pointed out, with the Collection de l'Art Brut Museum in Lausanne. And in Japan, we have a tradition of doing what's called the Jiko Shokai, which is the self-introduction. So I'll do mine, and then Sunny will do a Jiko Shokai as well. For many years, I was the senior editor of Raw Vision, the British magazine that specializes in art brut, outsider art, self-taught art. It was founded more than 30 years ago by John Maisels and is distributed internationally. It really is an important journal in its field. The Collection de l'Art Brut in Lausanne was founded 50 years ago as well. We're also celebrating a 50th. I was just there for the opening of the 50th anniversary exhibition, which is stunning. It's running till the end of September. Should you find yourself in beautiful Switzerland, go. This museum was founded by Jean Dubuffet, the French modern artist who in 1945 coined the term art brut. In French, it means raw art, after doing what European art historians call a prospecting trip in Switzerland to look for the kind of art on the margins that had fascinated him and his surrealist pals. This is some imagery from the Swiss Museum. It really is the world's leading museum of its kind and has a very active publishing program. These are some images from an exhibition of Japanese art brut that I organized in 2018 for the museum. 24 artists, many of whom, these are the catalogs in English, French, and Japanese. Many of the artists that were featured in the Swiss Museum's exhibition were associated with facilities in Japan like Creative Growth. Not all of them were. I've also taken part, thanks to being in Japan for a decade now, in the jurying of a national, international competition for disabled artists, which has been sponsored primarily by the Japan Foundation, which is a division of the Ministry of Culture in Japan. And this competition allows for disabled people of all ages to take part and win prizes and recognition for their artistic creations. It culminates in an award ceremony and in a traveling exhibition that normally touches down in several cities in Japan. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of institutions I've come to know and respect and collaborate with in Japan that are like Creative Growth, although sometimes smaller. This is one, Koboshu, in the city of Kawaguchi in Saitama Prefecture, just to the north of Tokyo. This one happens to have a weaving department with basic looms. This is an artist named Yokoyama Akiko, who is associated with Kyoboshu, makes abstract pictures that are very geometric like this, and were included in the show that I curated in Switzerland, as were these beautiful drawings by Nishioka Koji at the Atelier Corners in the city of Osaka, which is housed in a lovely old traditional building. He takes printed scores of music and, as you can see, completely interprets them. This is an artist named Kazumi Kamae. She's associated with a very active art center for disabled people called Yamanami Kobo in Shiga Prefecture. Probably Yamanami is closest in scale to Creative Growth in Oakland, and its facilities are very diverse, very well appointed. Its leadership is good at fundraising, but also the prefecture of Shiga, which is right next to Kyoto, has a long tradition of supporting facilities for disabled people, art-making workshops. It's not unusual to find ceramics there because Shiga Prefecture has a very long, deep, rich tradition of ceramic arts. Momoka is an artist whom has been shown here in the Outside Art Fair numerous times. She makes these beautiful fabric blobs covered in buttons. The Kyoto-based art dealer Yukiko Koide, who normally has a booth and is not here this year, unfortunately, has shown this artist's work. Also in Osaka is an institution called Big Eye. It's a very large one, and this was at the World's Fair in Osaka this last summer. I helped them put together an exhibition of work by disabled artists who had taken part in their programs in recent years. Finally, more recently, I curated an exhibition at this very interesting venue, which opened just before the pandemic in early 2020 in Tokyo. It's called the Tokyo Shibuya Koen Gallery. And it is the annex of the Contemporary Art Museum of Tokyo, which is very interesting because it shows that the Contemporary Art Museum of Tokyo, which is a city-funded institution, is now very actively recognizing the contributions to contemporary art of self-taught artists who happen to be disabled. 80% of its programming is that of features works made by self-taught artists who mostly have disabilities, and 20% is contemporary art, and very often the shows they produce mix the kinds of the art from different artists. This was the exhibition I curated, featuring the work of 7 artists. The title was Abstract Labyrinths, so the designers created a labyrinth style design using cardboard. This young artist named Ito Jun makes these exquisitely beautiful pictures using charcoal. Just to give you a taste of some of the art that's emerging in Japan, Shibata Eiichi, Shibata is a charming person, and he makes drawings that all have the same name, sekken, which means soap. He's fascinated with the texture and character of liquid soap and soap bubbles. Several years ago, during the pandemic, about 5 years ago, along with a small international team of artists and arts journalists and photographers, I founded brutjournal, which aspires to take the discussion of art brut and outsider art and so-called self-taught art into another direction, which is to broaden the critical and art historical discussion surrounding this kind of work, and to look at it in relation to other kinds of work that are hard to classify, innovative, experimental, not easily labeled. In the research that I do, in the writing and speech, speechifying, talking, lectures, I often try very much to make clear what the distinctions are between these nuanced categories of art brut, outsider art, and self-taught art. These are some of the graphics that I've produced over the years for such talks and publications. And I mention this because when we talk about the art produced by disabled people in art workshops, sometimes there's a debate, sometimes there's discussion about what exactly to call their creations, even going so far as to question if what they create is art at all. This is the book that brutjournal publishes once a year. brutjournal is an online publication, but once a year we publish a book called the brutjournal Annual that is an anthology of greatest hits of the previous 12 months online, plus new material. So by sharing with you this bit of background about myself, I wanted to let you know how and why I'm engaged with the kind of institution that Sunny represents and is now leading. So take it away, Sunny.
All right, good morning. I'd also like to thank Andrew Edlin, Elizabeth Denny, and you, Edward, for the opportunity to be in conversation today. And my slides are going to be more on a loop. I'm going to be speaking more about, giving you an introduction to who I am and where things stand at Creative Growth today. And so the images are just going to be kind of scrolling in the background there. So yeah, it's a real honor to be here today at the Outsider Art Fair, which has played such an important role in shaping the visibility and discourse around artists working outside traditional academic and institutional frameworks. The fair has also been a part of the historical arc of Creative Growth Art Center. Creative Growth first presented here in 2006, and so this year marks the 20th anniversary of its participation in the fair. So, I don't know, I feel like that should get some applause. I joined the organization in August after, as was mentioned, 25 years as a practicing exhibiting artist and educator, most recently as Dean of Fine Arts at California College of the Arts in Oakland and San Francisco for the past 7 years. And so, by way of an introduction, I want to begin with my background as an artist because it very much shapes my approach to this role. I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., influenced by time spent in the Smithsonian Institution, the American Folklife Festival, and the culture of Civil War reenactment in colonial Williamsburg. My mother is an early American crafts enthusiast, quilter, and collector of Americana and antiques. My father's a kite maker, engineer, and physicist who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency for more than 30 years. We lived in Iran for a brief period leading up to the Iranian Revolution, and we were evacuated just prior to the American hostage crisis of 1979. I completed my undergraduate degrees in art and psychology at Parsons and the New School in the late 1990s here in New York, and graduate study at the Yale School of Art and the Whitney Independent Study Program in the early 2000s. I was lucky to have teachers such as Ken Tisa, who's here in the audience today, who taught me about outsider art early on as an artist. And I certainly read a lot of Raw Vision magazines in that time as well. My work has focused on material culture and craft, particularly objects that emerge under conditions of constraint. I've worked with historical reenactment as ritualized performance of nationalism, craft and the construction of national and gender identity, military craft and trench art and what it means to make art in wartime, and what I think of as curative objects, objects made in situations of necessity as tools for time travel and intergenerational repair. And perhaps not too unlike Jean de Buffet, if I may, I've been drawn to forms of making that arise under extraordinary conditions, objects that offer some kind of reconciliation or to experiences of otherness or trauma. My work is also shaped by a queer and trans masculine lens, thinking about embodiment, identity, and how objects become tools for reimagining ourselves across time. And so alongside my studio practice, I've spent much of my career teaching, first in museum education at the Whitney Museum, and then in art schools and universities, thinking about what motivates artistic practice through thousands of critiques and studio visits, who has access to art education and art world participation, and how to kind of expand that access through that work, and what kinds of environments allow creative work to emerge and sustain itself. Since my first exposure to Art Brut and outsider art, I've maintained a longstanding engagement with it. And I should also mention that when I moved from New York to the Bay Area to teach at CCA, I lived in a storefront studio directly across the street from Creative Growth for almost a decade. And so that space now serves as an annex space for Creative Growth to house some of its art and archives. So stepping into my role at Creative Growth in many ways is a convergence of both personal and professional interests. So for those who may be less familiar, hold on one sec. So Creative Growth was founded in Oakland in the early 1970s by Florence and Elias Katz, an artist and a psychologist, during a period shaped by civil rights movements, including Black Power, feminist, LGBTQ+, and disability rights movements, as well as the independent living movement emerging in Berkeley. And this coincided along with the flourishing of cooperative and artist-run spaces, alternative spaces in California, in New York, and other art worlds. And at a time when many disabled people were being moved out of institutions and into community life, what was radical about Creative Growth was that it offered a hybrid studio and gallery model grounded in artistic practice and public visibility in contemporary art from day one. Creative Growth was not the only center that the Katzes founded, so I want to give a shout out to Creativity Explored and NIAD. Creativity Explored has a booth here at the fair as well. I'm beginning to understand the history of Creative Growth as unfolding across three broad eras. And each of them, in some ways, is founded in a moment of crisis. So the way I see it, in the founding era, from the early 1970s, around 1972 to 1998, this moment was really shaped by deinstitutionalization, as was mentioned, and disability rights. And the central question then was, can people with disabilities achieve freedom through art? So art making was really positioned as a human right and as a civil right. And then moving into the next era, which I think of as kind of the visibility era from around 1999 to 2024, 25, as the art world globalized and identity-based discourse expanded, Creative Growth artists entered major institutions and international platforms. So artists such as Judith Scott, Dwight McIntosh, Dan Miller, William Scott helped redefine what contemporary art could be. And so the central question I see as in terms of that era is, can Creative Growth artists, can disabled artists, so moving from disabled individuals making art to disabled artists, can they reshape the field of contemporary art? And so now we're at what seems like another crisis moment or another real shift, not just in terms of leadership at the organization, but in terms of the art world, in terms of culture, in terms of the geopolitical landscape. It's another moment of broader systemic instability across cultural institutions, across healthcare systems, and education, not to mention the impacts of social media, AI, as I said, geopolitical conflicts, polarization, climate, et cetera. So here, I think creative growth offers something durable as a model grounded in imagination, reciprocity, and care. So for me, the question becomes, can creative growth, can this model help to shape the future of the arts and of cultural infrastructure more broadly? So for now, I see the next era as one that reclaims and redefines our 50-year legacy of art and equity and care by turning radical acceptance and belonging into grounded structures and sustainable systems. Outsider art, whether described as art brut, visionary, or self-taught, has often been understood as work that emerges from an internal necessity, a strong expressive impulse outside conventional training or dominant art world frameworks. But at the same time, those definitions are evolving, and this is because no work exists entirely outside of culture, right? And at Creative Growth, what we see is not isolation, but a deeply relational environment. The studio is often described as hands-off, but I think I think that it's more accurate to say that it is a peer facilitation model. It's a model of accompaniment, which is one of the 10 principles of disability justice. So the facilitators don't prescribe the outcomes, they support artists in realizing their own intentions over time. This person-centered approach, which is also something that's now mandated in part of the funding that we receive, is also part of what keeps the work aligned with the ethos of outsider art, while at the same time expanding it. So at its core, Creative Growth is a long-term studio environment where artists with developmental disabilities are supported as artists, not through therapy or art instruction or art education, but through access to space, high-quality archival materials, artist-led peer-to-peer facilitation, and community. Artists come not for short-term programs or classes, but for sustained practice, often over decades. Many of our artists have been at Creative Growth for 20, 30, and even 40 years. Which is quite profound. And so I would really describe this as an ecology of making, which includes this kind of radical acceptance or permission, which is really difficult for most artists to attain in their lifetimes, a shared studio culture, a strengths-based approach to disability, and neuro-expansive ways of thinking and making. And while some have suggested that spaces like Creative Growth should eventually become unnecessary, I would actually argue the opposite. In fact, art schools, as we're seeing art schools crumble, for example, California College of the Arts, my own institution, just recently announced its closure in 2027. I think Creative Growth offers an inspiring model and a prototype. So most importantly, it stands as an example of how artists shape contemporary art from the inside out. So in closing, in recent years, Creative Growth artists have reached significant milestones, from presentations in the Venice Biennale to the landmark SF MoMA exhibition, The House That Art Built, which marked the organization's 50th anniversary and resulted in a major institutional acquisition, I think one of the largest acquisitions of art by disabled artists in history, over 100 works in that collection now, as well as William Scott's large-scale mural, which is the single largest commission received by any Creative Growth artist to date. And I was advised by one of our gallery team not to say how much money that was for, but it is absolutely profound and gives me so much joy and pride for William. At the same time, our advocacy is also expanding. We were recently invited to participate in a private congressional convening on the role of arts and culture in national policy. We were the only arts organization in the country that presented at that convening. And this was particularly thinking about the arts in relation to economic resilience, community revitalization, public health, education, cultural diplomacy, and social cohesion. And through initiatives like the Creating Community Conference, now it's going into its 7th year, Creative Growth continues to serve as a hub within a growing international network of progressive art studios. So as I step into this role, what I bring as an artist is not a desire to shape the work of creative growth artists itself, but a commitment to protecting the conditions that allow it to flourish. Because ultimately the artists are at the center. And my role is to support their freedom and their continuity of practice and the environments that allow that work to unfold over time. So I'm looking forward to, I'm going to leave it there. I'm looking forward to your questions. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Sunny. That was really informative. Really informative. The details of your personal life story, your personal journey as a creative person, and also the richness of the story of creative growth and the historical context into which that story fits for institutions of its kind. Also, very rich in detail and anecdote. I have many questions for you, but it's hard to know where to jump in. What I will say is this: as our conversation unfolds, and we touch upon different topics, it's up to all of us to hyperlink everything. All right? It's the hyperlink era. So something you just said. Let's touch upon the accomplishments over 50 years of creative growth, particularly something that is most well known for, as evidenced here in this fair, the success that creative growth has had in bringing to the art market and to the attention of the broader art establishment, not just in the United States, but internationally, the artistic creations of many of its participating self-taught artists who just happen to be disabled people. Now, that didn't just happen. That success occurred over a period of time thanks to certain approaches and perhaps strategic moves that your predecessors and their teams devised and carried out. So looking back, in order to look forward, can you tell us specifically what were some of the ideas that they developed and implemented to achieve those successes, and then how you might want to build on that foundation as you go forward?
Great. Actually, I love archives, right? I love histories. I love especially looking for untold stories. And so one of the things I've really been enjoying the last few weeks is that I discovered a pile of newsletters from Creative Growth, the early mimeograph newsletters from the 1970s all the way through up into the 2010s. And it was really fascinating to see these newsletters because basically if there were highlights from that year, they would appear, in these newsletters. So it was amazing to kind of track that on different registers. And one thing that's very clear is that from the very first moment of its conception, the idea of having a gallery representation, public visibility, dialogue with contemporary art and artists, exhibitions, museums, fairs, auctions, etc., was all part of the plan from day one. That wasn't something that has emerged recently. Creative Growth artists were showing in commercial galleries outside of Creative Growth's gallery, which of course was a key feature of the organization, but outside of Creative Growth's gallery, they were already showing within the first few years. I believe the first, museum exhibition was already in the early 1980s. The first international museum exhibition, 1990. And there were, sometimes even in these early days, 20 exhibitions external to Creative Growth happening in a given year, in addition to a very full gallery program of shows and public programs happening in the space itself. So as I mentioned, Creative Growth was part of this fair, but also surveys, exhibitions, and importantly, internationally. So early exhibitions at the Collection de l'Art Brut in Lausanne, and Museum of Folk Art and many others. And I think that the Outsider Art Fair was actually a very strong bridge for Creative Growth to then begin showing at the other art fairs such as NADA and Basel and Frieze and so forth.
Going to Basel, that's ambitious.
Well, yeah, but it makes sense too, right?
Of course.
So there are so many incredible milestones along the way, and so I guess just to answer your question, I think it was really intentional, and as I mentioned, the first impulse was really to try to create this platform for the individuals who were served by Creative Growth. But then moving on from that, I think it just kept increasingly ramping up. How much farther can these artists go? How many more barriers can they break down in the art world, in the art market, et cetera?
Okay.
And of course, the arc of Creative Growth coincided with, again, these key moments. The museum in Lausanne, founded really the same year, right? And
That's
then
right,
the outsider,
76.
markets are also booming in this time period. They're developing and booming, and so fortunately, Creative Growth was able to be a part of that.
That's
arc.
true. In fact, that's a very good point when I think about it now. The so-called specialized market for outsider art as it was developing in the United States really does coincide with the emergence of Creative Growth. And that's something that art historians can stick a pin in that for someone's dissertation. That's an interesting topic.
Absolutely, and I could show you the
role that you played.
the mimeographed newsletter at Creative Growth, where the director is like, have you heard of outsider art, in air quotes?
Yeah,
Because
because at the same time in the mid-'70s, you had the phenomenon of so-called artist-managed, artist-founded, artist-administered alternative spaces, cultural centers, that were non-mainstream cultural institutions, such as here in New York, Printed Matter, the Franklin Furnace Archive, Artist Space, very important new venues, which then established new models for what independent art centers could be.
Absolutely, that was hugely important in New York and also the Bay Area. The idea of artist-run spaces, artist-led institutions, has been very, very important historically in the Bay Area.
So there's a kinship between such institutions and the institutions that we're talking about today, aimed at serving disabled people with art-making workshops and, as you say, galleries. The model you just described that was Creative Growth from the beginning, to have the art-making workshop or studio, we can use those two words synonymously, as they often are, and a gallery, made a very strong statement, because it says we're going to take the work of our participating self-taught artists seriously and professionally display it, professionally share it with the public. That, again, I think that was a very bold move. I'll make an observation, then I want to jump in with another question for you. The observation is this: in my travels around Japan in particular, but also in Europe, either as an independent researcher or on behalf of the Swiss Museum, I've seen many, many institutions that are your counterpart institutions, large and small. Some are privately chartered and mostly funded through private foundations. Others are government institutions of different kinds at the municipal, provincial, or federal, national level. In any case, I mentioned Creative Growth to some of the administrators of these institutions, and they recognize your name right away. They look to what Creative Growth has done in the United States as a model. And some of the smaller institutions actually aspire to become the equivalent in their accomplishments someday of Creative Growth. That is to say, being able to have a recognized gallery and internationally recognized and valued art makers in their ranks. Here's something that you touched upon, and I've noticed this too in my travels among these institutions. You didn't use this word, but you've hinted at it very strongly. That is a sense of community. I've noticed in my travels that these institutions all offer and embody and exude a very strong sense of community that is deeply important to the people who run them, work at them, and the people who take part in their workshops. Can you comment on that notion of a community? Certainly you have one for 50 years.
Sure, yeah, and before we go on, I was thinking about the first part of your comment, and yeah, I think it's also important to note that in addition to being artist-run space, artist-run ethos from day one, it's really important to note that Creative Growth was an independent nonprofit. So while we might have examples of art in institutions of all kinds and lots of different variations on that theme, art being created within larger institutions or social services organizations, I think it's really important that Creative Growth was an independent nonprofit, and I think that still
Yes.
differentiates it from some of our peers out in the field. And early on, there was a recognition that this was a radical idea and that this was a new idea. I was reading the other day that Creative Growth appeared on World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Remember that?
Yeah, sure.
1991, as a national model, for an
interesting.
art center for
In
artists
91.
with disabilities. For the 35th anniversary of Creative Growth, Vice President Al Gore, was the host of the annual gala, and senators and congresspeople, city council members, as well as a number of, you've probably heard stories of other, famous artists and actors and folks, in Hollywood, who became, huge fans of Creative Growth over the years. So anyway, I think it's important what I'm learning, because even in my understanding of Creative Growth, my sense was like this was maybe the past decade, but it really goes deep,
Goes deeper,
all the way
okay.
back to the 80s and
All right.
90s. And then to your second point about community, I do think it's really important, and it's part of the mission, actually. This idea that it's a community-based organization as much as it is an arts organization, a disability rights organization. And so what you'll find at Creative Growth is an incredibly vibrant, joyful community. I will be up in my office, and I'll just hear, eruptions of cheering down in the studio, and I'm like, what is going on? I'll go down there, and someone finished an artwork. And the whole entire studio
exciting.
breaks out in cheering and joy and I mean, it's so inspiring. I can't even tell you. We are laughing and crying at Creative Growth every single day. And so that idea of community is so profound. It's so important to the organization, and yet it's one of these interesting tensions with this notion of outsider art. Because there's such a romanticized view of
The outsider, the
idea of the
marginalized.
outsider, the marginalized, the oppressed, the isolated. And so I'm proud of the way that our artists and our organization defies that particular signifier of outsider art,
Yes.
even though I understand that it's a productive tension. Like I don't think,
Yes.
I think it's still in circulation for a reason, Art
well.
Brut and outsider art. It's a productive tension, and I think it's okay to continue to navigate that,
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
That's why I mentioned that so often in my talks and writing, I very willingly discuss the nuances between the terms art brut, outsider art, self-taught art. That discussion is never going to go away, and it doesn't need to. It's all right. Something can be regarded simultaneously as more than one kind of phenomenon, and sometimes should be. Let's discuss briefly what we might call the protocols of an institution like Creative Growth that has an art-making studio. That is to say, especially for members of the audience who might not be familiar with these kinds of facilities, what actually goes on in the art-making studio? One of the bedrock principles I'll start with mentioning is this, and this is pretty much true throughout the world right now in these institutions. And that is, the administrators of the art-making studio, in which disabled persons take part, do not impose upon those participants ways of making their artworks. At most, they will provide materials and give a basic instruction in how materials are used, particularly when you're using a loom, for example. You might need to learn how to use the loom to weave. But then, once those materials are introduced in the most basic manner, the artist is off to the races. So can you comment on that protocol and others that you might employ?
Yeah. So yeah, when I came to creative growth, one of my questions is like, how do we kind of move beyond this idea that it's not therapy and it's not art education?
Right,
So
right,
what is
exactly.
it, right? I feel like we could do better to articulate what it is. Like, what is the magic that is able to result in this phenomenal artists and works of art? And so for me, I find the notion of interdependence very productive. Again, it's a principle of disability justice that I find productive. This idea of interdependence, the idea of dependence and independence. Has been something that has constrained disabled people, right? What you can't do, what you're disabled from being able to do. And so I think one of the radical aspects is, again, this idea of radical permission, radical acceptance. It's about what you can do, it's about your strengths. And I think it's obvious to anyone who looks at this art that the ways of perceiving and thinking and creating and communicating are absolutely, phenomenal. That people say it's pure, people say it's raw, people say it's, it sort of speaks for itself. You could say it's irreverent. Trying to find the words to describe what happens when these artists create is an ongoing, challenge. Because again, we don't want to constrain it. We don't want to, tie it down to any particular thing. And again, that's something that's been used against disabled people in the past. So it's very important to kind of get beyond that. So in terms of this kind of hands-off approach, another concern I had kind of coming in is like, well, coming from, again, like thousands of studio visits with young artists in art school, you would never just go into the studio and they show you your work and just not say anything about it, right? To me, there's something that is ableist about a completely hands-off approach.
Or talk
where
too
you're
much
just
about
like,
it.
No, you're just like, what are you going to do? They're showing your stuff and you're just like, go ahead. You would never do that out of respect for the artist. Art making is about a dialogue. It's a dialogue between artists. It's intimate, and I think that at Creative Growth, there's just a profound example of individualized communication. The artists at Creative Growth use many different forms of communication, many different languages. In some ways, the facilitator's role is to learn the language of the individual artist, and that is unique to each individual artist.
That requires a sense of respect toward
Absolutely.
that creator.
And another principle from disability justice, access intimacy, this idea of almost being able to predict what an artist might need in a particular moment. They don't always have to ask for it. They don't always have to express it. They don't have to articulate it. But over time, getting to know that artist, their preferences, et cetera, you learn a kind of intimate exchange where you're anticipating what the artist needs to really thrive. And they do. They arrive to the studio and they go immediately to work, and it's just the most productive space of creation that you can imagine, which is
I've
completely
witnessed this.
opposed to the idea of contemporary artists. It's all about my big private studio where I have time and space to think and be alone. No, these artists are sitting literally 6 inches away from each other, shoulder to shoulder, and yet they are able to lock in and focus on their work and produce just absolutely phenomenal work
Well, there's
side
the
by
community
side
building.
in community. So I do think that this idea of the hive of creation, that sort of beehive, is actually really important. And again, it goes against this idea of a kind of inside-outside. I actually read a really interesting passage in one of the articles that I was reading about creative growth, where Lucienne Perry, from
She was the second director of the Collection La Brute
Yeah.
for
So
about a decade.
She actually visited Creative Growth, and one of her goals was to determine if Judith Scott was truly an outsider artist, truly
really?
art brute, and whether she'd been influenced, by the staff. And then she decided, well, yes, because her communication is so limited. She had Down syndrome. She was nonverbal. Deaf artist. Et cetera. And I just thought that was so interesting that was even necessary to try to define it based on that. And I think again, if for the people that knew Judith Scott, you would say she was very much in community with those other artists, very much in communication with those other artists in her own way.
In her own
right?
way, a silent communication.
And just her art and what it said, what the moves she made in her art,
Okay.
what it expressed about her experience. It was very clear, and I think artists can pick up on that communication. We understand those languages of art,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
Even when the art form you're creating may be very different from that of some other art maker.
absolutely.
There is a common spirit, I agree with you. Just to touch upon the notion of art therapy, as you pointed out, there was a time when most of the art-making facilities of the kind we're discussing that are constructed and that aim to serve disabled people who make art, who want to make art. There was a time when they were known as art therapy workshops. There was the emphasis on the therapy, on the therapeutic aspect of the art making. Now, putting on my critic's hat, I'll just toss out a question, not to be answered just rhetorically, which is, well, one could argue that all art should have a therapeutic function, that it can or should or must, not only for the maker, but for the consumer, the listener, the spectator. And that's, ancient Greeks, the catharsis that one experiences through drama, through tragedy, through art.
Sure.
Go ahead.
This is a great topic. Yeah, I mentioned that when I was an art student, I was fascinated by psychology, right? And I got a degree in that, and then I actually got a certification in art therapy because I was very interested in all those intersections. But I ended up kind of abandoning art therapy at the time because in the early 90s, it just didn't seem to take into account the social factors that impact one's psychology. And so there were all these kind of, interpretive frameworks for interpreting drawings, and it was very set. It's like, do this house tree person test, and based on what you draw, this is kind of the diagnosis for the person. So I didn't feel really aligned with that, and that's sort of when I decided to go more into museum education, art education. But again, in looking through the past archives of creative growth, there were definitely still conversations in the early years, because art therapy itself was also a burgeoning field.
That's right.
Right? And so there were all kinds of programs at Creative Growth. You might have someone coming in to do living skills, communication skills.
Living skills.
Yeah, sort of. Well, and again, think about the early models of day programs for disabled people.
Yes.
A lot of it, unfortunately, is tied to capitalism and,
Yes.
and like getting jobs, right? So
Yes.
it's job training, job skills.
Yes.
How can we return these individuals to productive, to be, productive citizens, right?
Yes.
And so there's
Integrating into society.
integrating them into society, right? The kind of normalization, and again, I think creative growth was a really different model. There was some of that insofar as it might be supportive to the artists, but again, very quickly, it was really just about the radical possibilities of art, and so and some of those things still exist. There's professional development programs at Creative Growth. The artists are exposed to all kinds of contemporary artists through field trips, through artist talks, through workshops, visiting artists. And the staff work with them to develop their artist statements, to develop their portfolios. The artists know when their work is complete. They're selecting artworks for exhibitions.
As artists do.
Of course, right? So it's really it's interesting, this idea of therapy, and I think for me, art therapy is sort of a form of therapy. If you think in your mind of just talk therapy, it's that. Right, the kinds of
Yes.
things you're doing in therapy,
Yes.
but using art as a tool.
Yes.
And creative growth is just a very different model. It's not just using the art as a tool for the person's self-development, self-identity, and those sorts of things, which are of course profound and beautiful and important. But it doesn't. That's not the end goal.
Yes.
And so I think that's an important distinction.
Thanks very much to these institutions and these art-making facilities and the successes that places like Creative Growth have had, and of course the efforts and successes of the so-called disability movement on behalf of disabled people to be recognized as full citizens of their communities and not somehow lesser mortals. But thanks to these accomplishments, today, more and more disabled people are receiving respect. even in a country like Japan, where traditionally a family with a disabled child, there was actually in the past a sense of shame, and the disabled child was kept hidden, you know. Now there are numerous social welfare organizations, as they're known, and social service programs that attempt to bring disabled people into society with great compassion and care and empowerment, so that there's less of an us-them divide. I want to say one more thing, which is your comments hinted also, we don't have to go off on this tangent, but as we know, nowadays too, the language around art therapy for disabled people in particular, but just the language around disabled people in general has changed. It is less, how could we say, less stigmatizing in a negative manner. In fact, one doesn't say handicapped anymore, really, in contemporary American English at least. Other languages are trying to cope with synonyms, more pleasant, more fair ways. Again, in Japanese, we say shogaisha. It takes 3 characters to write this word. One of them, the second character, has a sense of injury, of being wounded, of being harmed. And one way, this is very subtle, one way to avoid being offensive by using that word, which still doesn't have a better sounding equivalent, is to not write the character, but to write the phonetic symbol for the character. It's a nuance, but that's a start.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think, again, these are active, ongoing conversations, right? I think in terms of the term disability or disabled, because it begins with kind of a negative,
that's right,
prefix, you're always going to have to grapple with that idea. And I think even in the artists that we currently serve, there's probably a huge range of individuals who either want to be described as disabled artists with disabilities, or not disabled at all. Many of the artists don't see themselves as disabled, and if you're judging them on art terms, they're not at all.
Yeah, very good point.
Right, and so I think it's really important. I think that a lot of people are still kind of evolving in their understanding of disability and the language around that. But I think one thing that I've learned from contemporary disability, justice discourse, is the idea that many artists in the contemporary art world today would choose would choose to describe themselves as disabled artists because disability is something created by the culture, right? It's the culture that prevents full and free access to all aspects of life. It's not on the individual. And so it's powerful to state that and to talk about that fact, that it's outside of the person. I think a previous understanding when you would say disabled person is that you might want to say that. You might want to say differently abled or something, because it sounds like a slight to the person.
Yes.
And it's not really how contemporary disabled artists see themselves. But again, there's a lot of nuance, and we can't really choose for the individual how they would like to be referenced. There's a kind of person-first approach, which is person with disabilities or artist with disabilities, and then there's an identity-first approach, disabled artist, by choice. And so I think it's important to respect that.
So the evolution of our language can and must move on, keep going.
Absolutely.
Before we open our discussion to questions from our audience, I have 2 more topics I'd like to touch upon. One is this: money. It costs money to fund an organization like Creative Growth and your very ambitious programs. Obviously, you fundraise. Fundraising is a key component of your everyday activity. You mentioned that in the past you had certain crisis moments that in the history of the institution, sometimes those crises were not born within, but were the result of external forces in society, in the economy, et cetera. Right now, as we know, the world is in crisis in so many ways we can't even begin to inventory them. But money flowing from government sources in the United States right now toward nonprofit institutions it's not flowing in a big way. We have a government that wants to, eliminate, if it hasn't already done so, the Department of Education. So, what can you speak about that challenge, and especially as you look ahead?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. I did want to talk about kind of the funding structure of creative growth. So currently, and going back decades, I think I started to see this as early as the mid-1980s. Creative growth has relied on a three-part funding structure. And so 1/3 of our income comes through grants, donations, from private individuals, organizations, philanthropy. 1/3 comes from art sales from the gallery.
That's remarkable.
It is. And the final third comes from Medicaid, from disability benefits.
Yes, explain that.
And it's really interesting because this was something that I was not aware of until I joined the organization. And is really key right now because we're facing threats to
That's
Medicaid, right?
That's
and
right.
so it's not helpful that people aren't aware of how much these organizations, not just Creative Growth, but most progressive art studios, are reliant on Medicaid funding. And so the way it works is that when individuals are diagnosed, and again, we're dealing with artists with developmental disabilities, primarily, so they're receiving their diagnosis sometime in their childhood, and as they're growing up. They will have caseworkers, and they're eligible for benefits through Medicaid, and in California, our version of that is Medi-Cal, and that that enables them to have funds that they can put toward all kinds of programs. So work, again, we mentioned work skills, day programs. There's also something called self-determination funds that
So
they
from the
they can get
Medicaid
funds.
point of view, such
Yes.
programs are regarded as curative, as
Well, that's a fascinating point, right? It's very much tied to helping the individual be productive, right, in society. Because again, those federal funds are going to be based on how well or not an individual is able to have a job
Okay.
and support
All right.
their lives and their independence, right?
Okay.
The irony is that if an artist makes too much money, then you will lose your benefits.
Oh, yes,
So
I've heard of
it's
that.
a very difficult systemic issue that keeps these artists and keeps disabled people at the poverty level.
That's
And this
interesting.
is a huge issue, right? So I think
Understandably.
because creative growth was so strongly leading with art, at the forefront more so than disability, even though obviously that is the beauty and the profundity of the whole experiment.
Sure.
Because it was leaning so hard on a sort of art forward narrative, it hasn't really presented itself as much in terms of disability, and so in terms of that reliance on that funding, it may come as a surprise to people that, oh wow, this is going to be really difficult. I mean, honestly, all three forms of income for creative growth are difficult now, whether it's the art market and art sales, whether it's individual giving, grants, et cetera. We've seen an erosion of arts funding, across the country. Art markets have been, flat the past
Sure.
couple of years.
Not here this weekend, though.
No.
Business is booming.
But yeah, so there's obviously a lot of challenges. I think creative growth is resilient, and has always looked for other kinds of diversified revenue, and there's all kinds of opportunities. And as you mentioned, there have been even greater milestones in the contemporary art world with the
Okay.
achievements of some of these artists, recognition of these artists. I have a
Okay.
lot of hope and faith in the curators of today and the museums today that they're taking a much more direct approach. And so I feel like the future is bright in
Okay.
some respects, but there's certainly a lot of challenges. Yeah.
So it sounds to me that as you go forward in your new role as executive director of the organization, you'll be keenly aware of those three existing and traditional funding sources, but you'll be looking to develop new ways to squeeze some cash out of somebody.
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
And it's a nonprofit. This is
Yes,
new for
yes,
me,
yes.
right? In higher ed, it's like, yes, the enrollment is going down, but you know the students are coming. You know what I mean? And so you have your base. With a nonprofit, you're having to raise those funds every
That's
year
right.
from different sources,
That's
over
right.
and again and again and again.
All
And
right.
so again,
Okay.
kudos to
Okay.
the past 50 years plus
Sure.
at Creative Growth.
Well, there's that
just
legacy
that creativity
that can serve as your
to keep
foundation.
it, to absolutely
Yeah.
keep it going. Yeah.
In contemporary terms, you have achieved brand awareness. Now, last topic that we should touch upon, and this might be one, who knows, that our audience might be interested in as well. Let's touch down briefly in the world of aesthetics. There are some observers out there who might even question, well, wait a second. How can a Judith Scott bundle, how can a Dan Miller abstract picture even qualify to be labeled as art? You hear it. You still hear it. Are there any aesthetic concerns that, over the years, Creative Growth's studio facilitators many of whom have studied art themselves, right, and make art themselves, that they have wrestled with when it comes to these rather ignorant-sounding questions about whether what the participants are making qualifies as art or not? Or are there other aesthetic concerns that emerge in your field?
It's an interesting question. I'm surprised to hear that people would question anything that Dan Miller or Judith Scott would make, whether or not that's art. I think, again, what's fascinating to me about being at Creative Growth is just simply walking through the studio and seeing an artist making something I have never, ever seen before, and then going to the next artist, never, ever seen it before, next artist, never, ever seen it before. Every single artist is making something I have never seen
Interesting.
before. And we serve, 125 artists weekly
That's
in
an enormous
the
number.
studio. We serve another 25 young adult artists and about 300 artists coming to our community programs and classes each year. And it's just like an absolute cornucopia of profoundly original work. And again, I've been teaching for 25 years, so I've met a lot of art students, and you do start to see kind of trends. And I think part of that is because of the problem of professionalization of art that we have done in art schools. I'm willing to to call that out, because I think so many young artists in art schools, they're trying to make works that are legible as contemporary art.
For a market.
Is it big enough?
For
Will
the
it
market,
sell?
yeah.
Will a gallery like this?
Yeah.
Is it as good as this artist? Can I be in that conversation? The artists at Creative Growth, to their great benefit, they do not engage with those types of questions. Some of them, they're very interested in how their work circulates. It's not like they don't care. Some of them are obviously their self-esteem and their self-confidence and their joy of knowing that their work is out there and it's being presented is just absolutely beautiful to watch. But there's something a little bit different than the art students I've worked with, where there's so much pressure on what it means to become an artist, to be a professional artist, to enter into the art world. The whole premise of it is
be validated by
The whole
this
premise
institution.
of it is that you can teach that,
Yeah.
right? And that you can learn that, and then you will be successful.
Almost in a strategic
So,
manner.
Yeah. So and these schools are not set up to serve the artists that we have at Creative Growth.
Yeah.
For my vote, they should get honorary degrees. If we care about degrees anymore, maybe we don't, because again, the art schools are kind of coming to their knees at this moment. But it's just an interesting, question, again, that relates right back to the insider-outsider institutional validation versus just the, again, direct artistic
Okay.
creation.
Okay.
So,
Very. I'll pick up that beat with my critic's hat on, and then we'll ask for some questions from our audience. As Nixon used to say in his press conferences when they would ask him questions, let me say this about that. Very often, I will see, in recent years, over the last 20 years, we've seen this. We certainly saw this at the 2013 Venice Biennale. The main exhibition brought together works by art brut artists, modern artists, many of whom were well known, and contemporary artists, many of whom were well known. under a theme, but there was an implicit message being conveyed through that and by that exhibition, which the media picked up and ran with. I will never forget the New York Times headline at the end of that year, 2013, which was in the New York Times art section, summing up the art events of the year. This was the year that outsider art came in from the cold. No. It wasn't in from the cold. It was hot from the beginning. It's not that proximity in an exhibition to recognize established modern art and contemporary art forms somehow legitimizes the work of self-taught artists. It's the other way around. It's the authenticity, the unquestionable authenticity of the work of the self-taught artist, in my humble opinion, that validates the presence of this other stuff, which is made for the market, which is made in conscious response to art history's narrative. It validates that establishment. What Dubuffet, we'll talk about this book in a moment, what Dubuffet called the official culture. So, there you go. Does anybody have any question for Sunny or myself about any topic? Let's start over there. Would you like to take this microphone? Oh.
How does an institution like Creative Growth reach out to find disabled artists? And conversely, how do disabled artists find Creative Growth?
That's a great question. So the question was, how do organizations like Creative Growth find artists, and how do artists find creative growth? So again, fortunately, from day one, Creative Growth has been built on this hybrid model. It's different in various progressive art studios across the country, but in California, we have a system of regional centers who act as a kind of mediary between individual clients, individual artists, and programs where they can have funded activities. So we have 99.9% of our artists at Creative Growth coming through the regional centers, again, through approvals made by case managers for any person that is interested. They have to be interested in art and creativity, and then they come to the organization, and it's basically open enrollment.
Do they have to show a portfolio?
And we have and many people never have made art before in their lives when they come. And actually, there's a famous story about Judith Scott that she was at Creative Growth for 3 years before she made anything.
Is that true?
That is true.
What did she do in that period? Other programs?
She came and she sat in community with those artists
Oh, I
quietly,
see. How
observing
interesting.
what everyone else was
Fascinating.
doing. Yeah. So, I think that there's actually a lot of opportunity for other individuals outside of that system who aren't necessarily reliant on that system to enjoy the benefits of programs like Creative Growth. I think there's a lot of ideas, again, in terms of a diversification of revenue that we could touch into that don't rely on that system, because it is not helpful for us to be as reliant on the Medicaid funding in these kind of volatile times. But it's never been the case that Creative Growth as an organization went out in search of amazing outsider artists. That was never the case. And actually, we have individuals from across the country actually calling Creative Growth to see if they can join our programs. During COVID, we were able to have access through Zoom classes.
That's remarkable.
And we just started having individuals actually moving to the Bay Area, almost like it's an MFA program, where the artists will come specifically to live in the Bay Area in order to come to Creative Growth. So it's a great question, and I think probably similar to a lot of the progressive art studios, it's kind of embedded within those social services networks right now, and that might need to change in the future. But it's if you think of a lot of the art that you're probably seeing down the Outsider Art Fair, you might think of the gallerist or the curator going out and sort of discovering this kind of idea of discovering, these artists in all kinds of places in the world, or posthumously. But it's very different when you think of the progressive art studios, and they still are very connected to the social services. Kind of tangentially related to kind of employment and sort of, again, community, home and community-based services. That's the actual category. But it's really it's important to know that at the federal level, the kinds of programs that these studios offer, the home and community-based programs and services, are considered optional by the federal government. So typically the way it works is the federal government will set budgets and the states will match those. But right now, as the federal government is making cuts, the states are then left to grapple with what is considered optional versus necessary. And so right now, you have the states saying, well, hospitals are necessary, healthcare is necessary, and so we're kind of come full circle. Because at the same time, there's some really interesting movements in neuroscience and neuroarts and art prescription programs where we might actually come full circle, where we were trying to get artists out of medical institutions. We're at a moment now where it's possible creative growth could be a model going back into the medical establishment if that's where the funding exists.
If that's where the money is, yeah, okay. There was a question, a raised hand here. Let's. Okay, this person here.
Hi, thank you both so much. It's been fascinating. I'm curious, can you comment on the politics of displays and exhibition making, really? There seems to be trends for salon-style displays coming off the wall, maybe more didactic material surrounding the work, and really sort of a maximalist approach. I assume that's probably because of the artist's own interests. And so I'm curious to hear both.
Okay, yes, I have an answer, and you have an answer? All right. This is a very interesting question of yours. I just spent several weeks in Switzerland working at the Collection La Brute on some new exhibitions, and we just opened 2 weeks ago the 50th anniversary exhibition, which focuses on artists who are Swiss or who worked in Switzerland, many of whom Dubuffet discovered, but not all of them. When you visit the museum, which is housed in an 18th century chateau on a hill overlooking the lake and the Alps, and you're nibbling chocolate, you notice that the walls are black. Our interior walls are all black. We have lighting, carpet, but everything's black. It's not the white cube that's now the sterile, iconic setting for the presentation of modern and contemporary art forms. Why black? Dubuffet believed, John Dubuffet, the founder of the museum, believed very strongly that black would not allow for distraction and would allow for the artwork, the object presented in such a setting to just pop, to really, really, like a spectacle, appeal to the visitor. So our lighting is subtle. In addition, sometimes with very fragile artworks, the light levels have to be somewhat low. So it's not as though you're walking in the dark, but it is a somewhat dramatic setting if what you're accustomed to is the white box. We also have some rooms that we call the white rooms that present some works in a more contemporary style. But there was actually a few years ago a young woman graduating from one of the Swiss universities in art history who wrote her dissertation on Dubuffet's black box versus the contemporary white box, and she presented it at a symposium that I attended. It was a very, very illuminating study that this young woman had done. Oh, you have a microphone.
Yeah, I would say there are so many things happening in museums and education departments, in curatorial departments, and in just exhibition design conversations about access. And so I think your question is bigger than this, but in terms of actually making exhibitions more accessible, and in terms of disabilities, that would include physical disabilities, but also sensory and perception and all kinds of things. I've seen some really amazing models where you have examples of language justice. You might have different materials translated into different languages in ASL and Braille, and you might have the placement of works at different heights, as you mentioned, to accommodate individuals of different heights and also wheelchair users. You might have interpretive materials, sensory materials. I think this is a huge burgeoning field, and so there's a lot to say about it.
May I jump in and say one last thing in response to your comment, your question? Again, referring to the Swiss Museum, but also in general to museums that specialize in showing art and outsider art. There has been a tendency since the very early days of this field to put an emphasis on the biography of the artist, which, by the way, the Swiss Museum doesn't refer to them as artists. They're either auteurs, authors in the broad French sense of creator, or créateur, créatrice. So we don't really say artist, we say creator or author. But this emphasis on biography is somewhat understandable because the works that you're looking at are coming from not the usual places, not the art schools, not the production system that leads to the established art market. So some explanation is necessary. However, over the decades, in my humble opinion, there has been sometimes too much emphasis on biography and not enough attention paid to what we would call the formal discussion of a work of art. So what I'm trying to do in my work and with brutjournal is to find that balance between presenting the story that informs the reader about where something comes from and the critical discussion that relates the art to a broader historical and critical context. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Sunny. Congratulations on your appointment as Executive Director of Creative Growth Arts Center, and we wish you and your team much success. And Sunny and I thank everyone again at the Outsider Art Fair for organizing this event and inviting us to take part in this year's program.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
We'll stay for a few minutes if we can to speak with you individually before going back downstairs. Oh, should anyone want to know, this book I'm referring to, this was just recently published. It's in French. If ever there was a need for a Bible of Jean Dubuffet's writing, this is it. It is edited by the aforementioned Lucien Perry, who from 2022 to 2013 was the director of the Collection de l'Art Brut in Paris. And she has assembled many of Dubuffet's essays, letters, for the first time in one volume. This is in French. An English edition should come someday. But Dubuffet never articulated the criteria defining what is art brut in one place. In order to find out what he thought, you have to read this vast trove of his writings, especially his letters, to get a sense of what his shifting ideas of art brut were.